Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to those who attended last night's webinar, and welcome to any newcomers. I'm Dominic Enter. I'm the Livestock Project Officer for StockSense, and I'll be hosting tonight's webinar on managing the winter feed gap, part 2, which will focus on sheep and goats. StockSense is funded by the Cattle and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Funds and is proudly delivered by the VFF Livestock Group. And the project was established to help Victorian livestock producers maintain and improve animal health and welfare and Victoria's overall biosecurity status. And in recent years, the project has focused more on education around hobby and small lifestyle landholders. This has been done through a number of workshops across Victoria, webinars, fact sheets on online on the website, and also through a quarterly newsletter, which if you'd like to sign up for, head to our website, which is up here. There's also a link to our socials, and if you'd like to get in contact, there is our email at the top. Your feedback is very valuable to us so we can plan our future workshops. Here's the QR code. If you haven't already, please scan the QR code. It'll take about 30 seconds. It's a pre-webinar survey. And we'll also have one towards the end as a post-webinar survey. These are our upcoming events in September. 6th of September, we have a stock handling workshop in Ballarat. And on the 21st of September, there's a working dog demonstration and farmer health check in Amphitheatre. So hopefully there's one near you. There's also more events we're having in October. You can view those on our website. Last night we had Chelsea Hare from Herd Solutions focus on cattle, and tonight we have Alison Gunn. She's a gun vet, and she runs a veterinary clinic and consultancy business, Herd Solutions, which is based in East Gippsland. She has worked as a livestock vet in Australia for 30 years. During that time, she has worked in clinical practice in every state of Australia, as well as teaching ruminant medicine and production at the University of Sydney and Melbourne. Alison has a passion for education and runs multiple discussion groups and workshops across Gippsland. So with that, I'll just another couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer these at the end. And a reminder, we have a recording of this, which will be emailed out to you along with the slides, either tomorrow or early next week. So Alison, I'm looking forward to what you have to present tonight, and I'll hand over to you. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dom. Great introduction. Yes, so I will now just get my slide sharing working, and then I'll have to go back and find you. I might have to mute my phone too by the sound of that. So let me just get this going first.
Life of a vet after our calls.
Yes, I should have probably put it onto mute, but anyhow, here we go. So 34 participants, that's good. Am I sharing yet? I'm not yet, am I?
No, you're not.
Okay, so here we go. Share. This is also the technical bit, getting that bit to work. And then I've got to find the bit I can see as well as you can see it. That sort of helps as well.
That's pretty good.
There we go. Can you see that okay?
Yep, great.
Beautiful. So some of you may have attended both sessions. I'm not sure. I'm hoping this is a little different from Chelsea's, but obviously it's the same session, so there will be some repetition. Repetition is often good, I think. I have deliberately made this aimed at smallholders and hobby farmers, etc. So it is a relatively basic level. But we thought we'd work through some principles, because obviously as vets we often get a lot of questions about looking after stock and running stock on small properties. So I've tried to answer as many of those as I can. So what we're going to talk about today is how much grass do my stock need, and other things associated with feeding pasture. Then we're going to talk about condition scoring. Then we'll delve a bit more into ruminant nutrition, end up talking a bit about what you can buy, what might be the best type of food, etc., and ending up with a little bit on common diseases around lambing and kidding, as a lot of people are probably either in the middle of that or about to start, depending on what happens on your property. So feeding livestock, getting it right, first of all, I think, is what is the stocking rate that you can run? And that will really vary from farm to farm, district to district, season to season, etc. We'll talk a bit about that. And we're going to talk about the type of pastures you feed sheep and goats, and then requirements for different classes of animals. And I think when you're starting up, like most of you have probably already got a property of some sort, but maybe you're thinking about doing something different. I think there's a few questions that you need to be thinking about. So what sort of stock are you running? Are these like low input stock? You've just got a couple of pet goats, or whether you're trying to breed sheep or have a little stud or whatever. So you're going to have different requirements for different enterprises. What sort of pasture type do you have? Have you got fairly poor soil with native pasture and maybe low phosphorus, or are you on some nice river flats with some really productive soil? Is feeding something you want to do? Are you happy to feed out during the winter and probably during February, March, when it's likely to be dry? Or is this a low maintenance property? You're pretty busy and all you want to do is run a few animals around and hopefully not feed them very often at all. If you are going to feed, having a tractor, having a feeder, having places to store. I think actually a really critical thing is, do you have somewhere to store hay, or is silage better because you don't need a shed? So these are all the kind of things you might need to think about. Do you have the capacity to feed hay or silage? Like most people can get small bales, but it's quite an expensive way of doing it. Or are you just thinking you might feed a few pellets when times get tough? Some of you might even want to be cropping, because this is obviously a way to fill in feed gaps, especially over the winter. And you're also going to have a higher feed requirement when you're kidding and lambing and when you've got young stock around, if you're going to do that. So these are all the kind of things that will affect, like if you're going to just have, as I said, a few, pet goats or something, you're not going to breed. Whereas if you're going to be breeding, you'll have peaks and troughs within your requirements. So you need to be considering that. And another way of dealing with poor seasons and good seasons is, are these pets, or are you happy to sell stock and then buy again if the season gets tough? But I think these are all considerations that will affect how many stock you can run. And also part of that is, what's your pasture growth curve? So there's this website called Evergraze. It has pasture growth curves for different types of grass for right across Victoria. So you can probably find somewhere near you. If most of you probably know when you've got good grass and not such good grass, but you need to be thinking, what is my stocking rate going to be when I have very little feed? Because it's and then how am I going to manage if we're going to have lower stocking rate? How are you going to manage those high areas when you've got spring growth and lots of grass around? So one of the things, there's various ways we can talk about how to feed stock. One of the things we talk about is DSE, which is a dry sheep equivalent. And it's actually, I think it's Australian way of looking at stocking rate, but it's like how many wethers, basically, how many wethers that you're not lactating adult animals, they're not growing, could I run on a property? See, I should turn that off, shouldn't I? So yes, that would be the that would be something that you really need to think about. So this is a table from the New South Wales, the Victorian government, and New South Wales government all have good books and resources with that sort of thing in, and it will tell you how many, so what equivalent DSE is. So first of all, you're going to say, right, I'm going to run pregnant ewes. So in fact, in that, you know, if your stocking rate, we should talk about what it's going to be, but I would work on 6 to 10 per hectare. Okay. Unless you've got really, really good grass for most places around here, and across Victoria, if it's not really good grass, you're not really pushing the system, you want something that's comfortable, probably 6 to 10 dry sheep equivalent per hectare. Okay. So then you can say, well, how many sheep is actually that? I actually want to have pregnant animals, so I'm going to need to actually have half of that. So if I can run 6, it's a sort of got a bit of native pasture, maybe a little bit of improved grass. You might say 6 is a nice comfortable number. So I could have 6 dry sheep. That probably means I can have 3 ewes per hectare. And that will comfortably mean I don't have to feed very much at all throughout the year. Okay. And I think it's really just trying to get an idea, talking to local farmers, etc., what would be a reasonable stocking rate. 10 is probably okay in most places, but then I think you would have to feed at some point. And certainly if you've got really lush, great river pasture or something like that, you could probably run double that. But it's really going around and saying, well, how many dry sheep could I run? Okay, so 1 dry sheep is equivalent to half a pregnant sheep's the other way around, if you see what I mean. And so we can look at DSE, and there's tables of DSE. So I would say to people, start off with 6 to 10 per hectare, and if see how that goes for the first season. And if you've obviously got heaps of grass, well, maybe you can up it. So DSE for goats and sheep is going to be fairly similar, but that is also available, and Dom's going to be sending these out, so he will know. You'll be able to see these resources, and they're also all available online. So how much grass is a sheep going to eat? Well, most sheep are going to eat 1.5, 2 kilos of grass a day. Okay, so that is actually dry matter, not wet matter, so it's actually more in actual grass. But with sheep, with grass, we actually count it in dry matter rather than in actually how much wet matter is there, because it does vary quite a lot. So we also then measure pastures in dry matter, and I'll show you how to do that later. Sheep generally like shorter grass. So these are, this is a paddock that, it's actually the same paddock, but it's in a trial that I'm involved with at Gippsland Ag Group. And the slide on the right is mainly clover, so it's different species within the same paddock. It's after grazing with sheep. And on the left, there's a lot of tall fescues. Sheep don't like to eat long stalky grass, so they will leave a lot of it. Whereas if you've got shorter grass and lots of clovers, they'll burrow right in down to the grasses, and they'll find all those clovers and really yummy bits and eat them out. So, but if you put them in really long grass, they don't handle it very well at all. It's really hard to get them to graze well. So this is another paddock. This has actually got a lot of cooch in it, so it looks like it's actually pretty poor. But in this paddock, this was actually taken this week. There's some grass and some clovers coming through, and some other little legumes, and the sheep are getting down and burrowing into that and eating that. So even though it doesn't look like there's much there, there's actually good sheep feed in that paddock. But also, if you're going to say how much grass have I got, that dry grass is not going to be sustainable for anything. It's cooch, so it probably isn't even sustainable for weather, but it's not going to be sustainable for a lactating ewe, because it is really it's nearly dead, and it really hasn't got much nutrition at all. But underneath that story, there is actually some good pasture now coming through. This was another paddock with sheep on it. Sheep will eat grass very, very, very short. The only problem with having sheep eating grass very, very short at this time of year is it really, really wants to get away, and its leaves are its solar panels. So I would encourage anybody with sheep or goats to have some sort of basic rotation, so 3 or 4 paddocks minimum, and that's actually really beneficial for worm control as well. Now, if you've only got 3 sheep in your backyard, that's probably not going to work. But even if you just had it one side fenced off and then the other, then that actually is just a little bit better from worm control. 4's better again, and more is better again still. But with this paddock here, the sheep are in there, it's probably growing at 10 kilos a day. So that would sustain, say, 5 sheep, the actual growth at this time of year. And you can't actually see it growing because they're eating it down so much. But the problem is that the grass is getting eaten so quickly, it doesn't have much actual leaf, and that means it doesn't have much root, so it's not going to get away. So at this time of year, if you've got really short grass, it's really beneficial if you can shut some of it up. Even that means you've got to supplement more, and that will let that grass get away. It doesn't have to get too high for sheep. It only needs to get maybe 5 or 7 centimeters, and you've got really good feed there. But then once it's got those bigger solar panels, it's going to grow better. So a real key takeaway is, if you have lots of really short grass and you're really feeling it's hard work right now, I've seen quite a few down animals in the last couple of weeks just because it's the end of winter. People are getting a bit short of feed. But right now, if you can just shut some area up and actually feed them on another area, that grass is now going to start growing and you'll have feed ahead of you within a few weeks. This is a dairy pasture. Another photo I took this week. That would be about the longest. That grass was probably up to my gumboot. That's getting almost too long for sheep. There's some nice chicory and stuff in there. They would really like that. And they really do, they really do like chicory and all the lucerne and everything. But once it gets too long, they start leaving it. They certainly would eat all that really nice grass, but when it gets stalky and goes to seed, they're not going to necessarily eat all those seed heads out. It's important to understand, and it's that basically your really active growing grass has got a lot of energy and it's really highly digestible, got a lot of water in it. But as that grass gets dead, it isn't very good. So that cooch is really not sustainable for anything really more than an animal that's not lactating and not growing. So to have an understanding of the type of pasture you've got in your farm, and also at what point it's actually going to providing good nutrition. And once you get past Christmas, a lot of the time you're putting up seed heads. Those pastures do not have the same level of nutrition that a really active growing leafy green spring grass would have. So here again, even though that green short pasture is very short, it's certainly got far more energy in it than the cooch on the other side of that picture, because it is young and green and really trying to get away at this time of year. So goats love to browse. And so, if you've got any bushes in your place, goats aren't really grazers. They are definitely animals that will eat every bush or shrub. The downside of that is, if you're thinking of getting goats, if you've got goats, it's really worthwhile going around your garden or around your property and checking you don't have anything toxic. So things like oleander, green cestrum, nightshade, etc. is really not very helpful at all, because they could eat it and get sick. Lantana, laurel, there's a whole list. If you look on the web, it will give you a list of anything that's toxic to ruminants. So they will eat it, and you really need to be sure that anything you've got on your property is not toxic. What they're going to like is wattle, she oaks, eucalyptus, and lots of Australian natives. They also do eat noxious weeds that are not poisonous, such as blackberries, brooms, gorses, lantana. They can eat a little bits of, but you've got to be really careful. So they're going to eat those and do a really good job of it. The other thing that goats will eat really well are your invasive grasses, like your love grasses and Chilean needlegrass to a lesser extent, but they do hoe in and eat a lot of the weeds, and they're good to clean up weeds on a property. While we're talking about feeding goats, goats have a much more varied diet than sheep. One rule of thumb is that if it's anything that would go well in compost, it's likely to be okay for goats, but there's those few things you want to avoid giving them too much of, things like onions and avocados and things like that. But people feed them corn chips, all sorts of things. You've just got to be a little bit careful what you feed male weather goats, because they are pretty prone to getting urinary stones, and then we get all sorts of problems with blocked bladders. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so that's a bit about the type of grass. So obviously, like a lush ryegrass is going to provide a lot more feed than a native, and then you've got your cocksfoot's and your phalaenopsis, which also provide great feed for sheep and goats. If you want to actually work out how much you've got there, then there's this really little handy resource, which if you're an MLA member, you can get free from MLA, and it's called the pasture ruler. And on one side of it, so it's like a little ruler. I probably should have had one here, but it's just like a little ruler you can put in your pocket, keep in your car, whatever, and take it down the paddock, and you pick 5 or 6 spots, and you measure like the top of the average height of the grass, and you can calculate how many kilograms of dry matter there are. So that's how we're measuring grass. And so you can say, okay, there's 2,200 or 1,800, and you don't want to eat it below 1,200, because then you don't have enough grass. You know, the leaves are going to take a long time to grow back again. On the back of it, there is some recommendations. So it gives for different types of grass. So a really lush ryegrass, you're 11.2, or maybe a cocksfoot or something being a 9. It gives you how much the minimum. So it gives you different amounts of grass. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't have done that for you. So yeah, so it's basically giving you what they can graze up to and down to, etc. So there's really good information on the back of that as well. So it's a good little resource. Now I shouldn't have done that to my screen. So as an example, if you had some ewes and lambs with a single lamb, they're going to need about 2 kilograms dry matter a day, maybe a little bit more, but they're also going to trample and lie and poo on grass. So you also get about the same amount, half as much again, wastage. To 30 to 50% of your grass gets wasted. So if you had half a hectare of grass and you went out and estimated it had 1,800 kilograms dry matter, then you eat down, you say, right, I want to eat down to 1,400. I don't really want to smash this grass down. So that says you've got 400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare available, okay? And so I did say half a hectare here, so I've just realized my maths are wrong. So if you had 20 sheep, and I'm going to presume it's 1 hectare, I'll change that when I send it out. So you've got 1 hectare of grass, you've got 400 kilos available, you've got 20 sheep, so that's 20 kilos each. And so they're going to use about 3 kilos a day, so that's nearly 7 days. So you can say, right, there's 7 days worth of grass here. And so that's a lot of the time how many farmers will go around and estimate, if they're moving from paddock to paddock, roughly how long the animals are going to stay in there. Obviously, you're going to check them and have a look and etc., etc. But it's often useful to use that information together with, well, there's not enough there. I need to leave them in this paddock for 2 weeks because I've only got 3 paddocks. So I need to let the grass get away. And at which point you're going to say, well, I've got half of the feed here from the grass. And so how much supplement do I need on top of that? And we'll talk more about supplementing and working out how much we need later in the talk. So we have, first of all, we have considered animal requirements. Sorry, first of all, we've considered the amount of grass we need. And now we're going to think about animal requirements. So again, it's important to think, what am I trying to feed? So if you have just those couple of goats that aren't growing, or sheep that aren't growing, that are just pet ewes or whatever, and you're not getting them pregnant, then that's a very different requirement for anything that's pregnant or growing, etc. Young growing stock and pregnant animals require a lot more energy. And the problem is because they're either small, so their rumen's really small, or they've got a lamb in them so that they haven't got much room in their abdomen. They can't eat a lot of bulky feed. So something that will feed and sustain a larger adult animal is not sufficient for a younger animal. We also need to be thinking about, is it cold? I think a lot of the problems we're seeing at the moment is when an animal gets really thin, it then doesn't have the fat to protect it. So it's feeling the cold more, it shivers more, so they use more energy and becomes a vicious circle. So skinnier animals in your flock, they get skinnier and skinnier whereas the fatter ones don't require so much energy for heat regulation when it's cold, and so they stay fat, and the skinny ones get skinnier and skinnier. So sometimes when you've got that big disparity between different animals, there's obviously a whole heap of genetics in there, but it might also be that you've got the bigger ones are maybe getting to the feed. If you're supplementing, they're getting all the feed and the little ones aren't. Or it could just be that it's really cold and those skinnier ones are really feeling it. Particularly probably more goats, and we're not talking about cattle, but cattle, where sheep have obviously got the wool. But obviously if you've shorn them recently, that definitely applies to them as well. Any stress, any disease, any exercises, etc., that is definitely going to be important to that's going to be important to consider as well. But the most important thing is the age and the size of the animal and whether it's lactating or not. So your kids and your growing stock need your high quality feed. And so the younger the animal, the higher quality feed. So if we're looking at pellets, which we'll talk about later, you need much more protein in a pellet for a very young kid than you do for an adult ewe. And energy as well, but definitely, those young growing animals require protein, which is available in green grass, but not so available in hay and dry grass, because protein is required for muscle and they need to use the protein to grow. And then lactating sheep and goats also need high quality feed because they're trying to produce milk, and there's a massive energy requirement in producing that milk. And when they've got twins, they also need really good feed and shelter, particularly pre and post lambing with your twins, because if they are going to have to look for feed, then they're going to leave their lambs, and then often you get mismothering or the lambs get deserted. So when you've got twins, it's really good to have good feeds. They don't have to go far to look for feed, good shelter, so that they can get their lambs in a nice protected place. And then obviously, if they're over fat, so this is the thing, if you're feeding for twins and you have some singles, then you can end up with some big singles. So if they're over fat, then they're more likely to have problems getting birth. So we'll talk about what condition score we want them in a minute, but it's also bad to have them too fat as well. So your non-lactating animals or ewes that aren't going to lamb for a couple of months, they can eat much lower quality feeds. They can have dry hay, grass, high dry grass and hay, which has got a lower energy. So when you make silage and hay, basically you cut the grass, but it's still using up the energy. So the longer it lies on the ground, the more energy it requires. So if you take a really good crop of grass and you turn it into silage, generally silage is put in a bale within a day, and so it's lost a little bit of energy. If it's hay, then it's lost more energy. So as a rule, grass is best. Silage is second best for those animals that require good energy levels, or pellets, because again, that's got high energy. And hay, you cannot grow young stock on hay alone. And hay is also not appropriate for lactating animals as a sole feed either, because they just can't physically eat enough generally, unless it's a very high quality hay. They cannot eat enough to maintain their energy requirements. So when you're looking at, if you're going to supplement, you decided, right, well, we're happy to feed out. We're going to feed out in the winter. We want to have a few more animals so we can eat through that spring excess grass. That means we're going to have to feed in the winter. We might have to feed early autumn. Then you need to be thinking, what sort of feed do I need? And one of the things to consider is you need to be thinking, well, I'm going to have lambing sheep or kidding goats or whatever. And so we actually need to be able to feed for those rather than just get something that will do the sheep when they're a couple of months off lambing. So how do we know if sheep and goats are fit and healthy? And the way to do that is condition scoring. And that's much harder to do in a sheep. It's easier to do in a goat or a cow, because it's got wool. It looks like it's really fat and healthy. It's got all this wool on it. But in fact, when you go and get it in, you can discover it's pretty skinny underneath. So you need to be condition scoring at least every couple of months, particularly when there's a feed pinch, but also you don't want them too fat, especially coming up to lambing. So it might be that if you've got a really good season and you've got something like lambing coming up, then you actually might want to go, well, we want to actually give them a bit less feed and shut them up or something. So, but generally it's more keeping them fat enough, and so we need to condition score. So I've taken these from Lifetime Wool. There is a whole document available online, which is referenced here on how to do it. But basically what you're feeling is you feeling across the backbone just behind the ribs. And it's basically almost like the tips of your fingers. So when they condition score 1, it's like feeling the tips of your fingers and the fingernails. And when they condition score 4, so 1, 2, 3, it's like the back of your hand. Okay. So it's you're feeling for the level of fat at that level. And we need to keep those ewes with twins and triplets to have at least condition score 3. So I'll go through them a bit more. So our optimal condition score is 2.5 and 3.5 for most things, actually. That's where we want them. So condition score 2, we can feel the bones across the backbone. So the backbone is, you see the mouse on here? So this bit's the backbone here, and this is what we call the short ribs. So it's actually a bone that sticks out. It's called a transverse process, if we're going to be technical about it, but it's on your rack of lamb or whatever, it's the bit behind the ribs. So it's a bone that sticks out. So your backbone is feeling that narrow ridge, but you can feel the points, but you can feel muscle on it. And then your short ribs, again, you can press in between them, but they are definitely covered with flesh. Whereas if they're condition score 1, they're very, very pointy. And then when you get to condition, so the conditional 2, you want them more than condition score 2. So you shouldn't be really feeling this pointy bit between the ribs. Okay, so condition score 3 is your optimal position. So your vertebrae, you can just sort of feel these lumps on the top of the back, but you've got this eye muscle beside it, which is, you can feel around it, but you can't push in between it. Okay. And then when you go down on the side, the short ribs are well rounded and filled up with muscle. So you can feel the rounded edges, but you can't press between them. And it's a question of getting them in and just practicing, right? And going, oh, I can actually feel, if you can feel the backbone and what they call the short ribs really easily, then the chances are your sheep are too skinny. And if you can't feel them at all, then your sheep are probably a little bit too fat. So as I said, 2 is your minimum, and really you want to have them 2.5 to 3. So you shouldn't have breeding ewes or weaners less than condition score 2. And if they're less than 2.5, they're not going to produce enough milk. They're more likely to die, and they're less likely to get back in lamb again. And that also applies to goats and kids as well. So if you want your optimum production, we want them 2.5 to 3.5. And if they're too fat, then they tend to eat a little bit more. So you're not obviously optimizing your stocking rate, but you're also running into potentially running into health issues with them being really fat. And you also can have running into lambing issues as well. So if they're used pre-joining, want them 2.5 to 3.5. With singles, if you get them scanned into singles, so some people will get their ewes scanned as pregnant. So your singles, you want a little bit less than 3, but if you know they've got twins or triplets, then they want to be 3 to 3.5. So if you don't scan, but you know you generally have got a prime lamb breed where you're getting twins and triplets commonly, you want to make sure that your sheep are condition score 3 pre-lambing, so they've got enough fat in the system that they can adequately support 2 or 3 lambs all the way through until they wean them. And again, with your rams pre-joining, we want them on the fatter side because they're going to go out and work. And so to work, they don't eat as well, they get really skinny, and they're not going to do as well towards the end of joining if they're not in a good enough condition at the beginning. So to reiterate what I said earlier, you've got the condition score is relatable not just to whether they get pregnant or not, but also to whether they have twins and triplets or not. So if they're in poor condition, you're less likely to have twins and triplets. So really important to get your sheep in occasionally feel it on their backbones, particularly coming, so a month off mating, you know, you're probably going to be doing things like drenching them prior to lambing. So at that point, condition score, depending on how many you've got, you want to do, you know, up to 20 or 30 sheep, if you have that many, and get an idea of where they're at. And if you've got a lot of skinny ones, you might then want to put them in a different mob and preferentially feed them. So let's talk a little bit more about nutrition, because I think that's actually quite important as far as understanding how to feed a ruminant. So we've got, we obviously need to give them some sort of forage. All ruminants need forage. We'll talk about why in a minute. So that's either grass or hay or silage. Then we need to make sure they've got enough minerals. A lot of the time they've got that in their grass and hay and silage, but if they're on a crop or very lush feed sometimes, or you're having problems around the time of lambing, it's possible you might need to put salt or calcium or phosphorus in there. You can make up a loose lick, but probably if you only got a small number of animals, there's a number of different products available through your feed store. And the other thing to consider across Victoria is selenium, cobalt, and copper. We particularly have a lot of selenium deficiency in this state. Now, selenium, cobalt, and copper, all important for the immune system, for growth, for health, for metabolism. So the cobalt is important in the energy cycle. And so if your animals are low in that, they don't do as well. It is very variable across the whole state. And in fact, both selenium and copper, you've got to be a little bit careful because you can overdose it. So I strongly recommend you to go talk to your local vet about what are the deficiencies likely in your area. You can do a pasture test and find out what's there, or you can do blood tests to find out what you need. But if you're feeding pellets a lot of the time, then they will have them in it. But if you're not feeding pellets, then it's really important, particularly that selenium one, to actually know whether you need to supplement it or not. Obviously, all stock need fresh water, and it should be good, clean, fresh water. And you might need to give them grains to help supplement instead of a forage, depending on what other feed you've got to put with it. And we'll talk more about that later. So sheep and goats require forage all the time. Goats prefer browse or shrubs, and that should really be 50%, or they would prefer that to be 50% of their diet. It is often a good idea to supplement with grains during lactation and growth periods, particularly if you've only got quite a high fibre feed because they physically can't eat enough. We need to make sure we've got the mineral supplements right, and we need to monitor the condition score. So let's talk about why it's so important to have consistency in the feed. So for those of you that brew beer or make bread, when we're feeding a ruminant, we're actually feeding bugs, like feeding you yeast, but these are mainly bacteria. There's yeast there too. So your rumen is basically like a big fermentation vat. And all your grasses and everything they eat goes into the rumen, and it's broken down by the bacteria. And that is then once the animal has grown to sort of 5 or 6 months of age, their rumens are really big, and basically that vegetation sits in there, it gets broken down, it forms balls of cud which they regurgitate, and also the bacteria basically breaking those plants down and creating nutrients which go through the wool. So instead of, for humans and dogs and cats and everything else like that, we're taking glucose. What is actually produced in the rumen is a thing called a volatile fatty acid, and it's a byproduct of the fermentation by the bacteria. Then we have the reticulum, which is at the bottom. The large feed particles go down to the bottom there. They form into a cud ball. They get regurgitated. The animal chews it again to break it up a bit more so the bacteria can break it down further and then re-swallows it. We then have a thing called an omasum, which is here. In the meatworks, they call it the Bible because it's like a filter. It's got like leaves all the way through it, like a book if you open it up. and those leaves trap all the large particles. So the only thing going through to the fourth stomach, which is a true stomach like ours, is actually lots of bacteria and some very small particles or smallish particles of fiber. All the big particles of fiber stay in the rumen and are broken down, which means if you're feeding a very high fiber diet, then it takes a long time to break it down. So they get very full. So sometimes when you see those animals that look like they're really rotund, and people often say to me, well, that one's pregnant. Well, often they're not. They've just got some really high fiber feed, and the whole rumen is full of this feed, and they're trying to eat more because they're hungry, but it just takes a lot to break it down. So the bacteria in the rumen produce the energy, and then they also multiply, and their cell walls are producing protein. I think I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute. And basically, those bacteria are then actually digested within the fourth stomach and also utilized by the cow. So, yeah, so here's that bit, okay? And so as we feed different feedstuffs, then we have different types of bacteria able to break them down because they've all got slightly different characteristics. So there's like literally thousands of different types of microbes, most of them bacteria, but also protozoa and yeast in the rumen. And when you feed different feeds, then the population will change. So you'll have different types of bacteria to break down grain that will be breaking down, say, your sorghums or your lucins, for instance, okay? So basically, your rumen needs to adapt to that. So a key principle of feeding any ruminant is that you shouldn't change the feed rapidly and that you should be very consistent in what you feed it. So, you know, I have met producers that say, well, I've got lucerne silage and I've got oaten hay and I've got some grain and I'm giving them a different thing every day because I know they like the variety. Well, the animals might like the variety, but the bugs in the rumen don't. So to have a really efficient digestive system for a ruminant, you need to have consistency in what you feed them. So if you change a type of hay, you change a type of grain, then you want to shandy it for a few days, particularly if it's a massive change. So you're going from, say, a lucerne silage and you're putting them onto an oaten hay. That's a big change. So over a week, you want to feed them both and then move from one to the other. So consistency is key. So you have really efficient bug digestion and they can work with it really well. And it's going to take at least 10 days. And realistically, if you take an animal off a very lush feed source, say a dairy cow, or dairy cow's a good example, and it's on really, really lush ryegrass, and you put it out the back on a paddock that's pretty bare and has only got some sort of scrubby stuff and native pasture, it's really going to take a month before its rumen's adapted to that different feed. And so the problem is that it's going to struggle because it's got to eat a lot more feed, and so there's not enough energy in that feed anyhow, but also the bugs are not adapted to it. So whenever you take any ruminant and you've got to change its feed, and especially when the feed type's getting poorer, you've got to remember it's also going to take longer to have the right bugs to break that down. So as I said, the bugs are multiplying all the time, so like bacteria do, and they're utilizing the carbohydrates to produce energy out of the plant, and they're utilizing the protein, which is in the cell walls, to actually produce the bug walls. So to actually, if you don't have enough protein in your feed, even if there's enough energy, then the animal can become energy deficient because there's not enough bacteria there. And then those bugs go into the fourth stomach and digested by the sheep or goat, and then that is turned into protein, which they can use to build muscle or make milk or all the things that is needed for survival in life. So yes, insufficient protein is fewer bugs, so they also become energy deficient if you have a low protein feed. So your key nutrients for ruminants. So if you think about it, you look at your Wheaties packet in the morning, and humans, we talk about calories and we talk about kilojoules. Well, in sheep and cows, because they're bigger, we talk about megajoules. They're just thousands of kilojoules. So we talk about energy and we talk about it in megajoules. We talk about protein percent, exactly like your Wheaties packet. And we also are concerned with fiber. We're not concerned with fat. There is some fat in pasture, but as a general rule, we don't want to feed ruminants too much fat because it sits in the rumen, it stops the fermentation process. So fat is not a thing we're worried about. We want to make sure we've got enough energy, enough protein, enough fiber, but not too much. The bugs need the fiber to sit on and fermentate. And if we don't have enough fiber, the fermentation becomes very rapid. And so what can happen is that can actually make the animal sick with something called acidosis, because you get very rapid fermentation, because generally those things without fiber are grains. They get broken down quickly. That drops the pH in the rumen due to the rapid fermentation. And you can actually kill your animal by just feeding them grain. Now, sheep and goats, particularly sheep, can handle much higher levels of grain than cattle, but they still need some fiber within their diet. And if you're going to give them a high level of grain, you've got to adapt them over a period of several weeks rather than just go, here you go, sheep, have 3 kilos of wheat, and you've never had it before. That's probably going to make that sheep really sick. So, so your fiber is also important, but if you have too much fiber, that affects how much they can eat. And so that can also restrict them. So your energy, as I said, that's your energy supply. It's used for all your chemical processes, and it's produced by the rumen microbes, utilized by the ruminants to fuel their cell. If you've got no energy, then, you know, it's like our glucose, then they're going to be very lethargic. And the more with your plants, the more energy they got, the more digestible. So the more digestible plants have higher energy, which goes back to this graph or chart we had earlier, where your very lush green plants have got high energy and are very digestible, which means that they haven't got much fiber in them, so they can be broken down very easily. Whereas your dead grasses have a lot of fiber in them, etc. Protein comes from the all plants. Everything's got protein in it. So protein comes from your plants. There's a whole heap of different proteins in there. And as I said, it's then utilized within the rumen to make rumen cell walls and rumen protein. And so you need a balance of both to have correct, well-balanced rumen. You've really got to think, I'm feeding these bugs fermenting in this fat, and that they are feeding the cow or the sheep or the goat. And then NDF. So NDF is our level of fiber. We don't want to have it less than 20% for most things, certainly as a total ration. But your low NDF foods are generally high in energy, highly digestible. So that's your grains. And it also allows them to eat more. So the problem is they can sit down and eat 3 or 4 kilos of grain sometimes, which would make them really, really sick. Whereas they probably can't eat 3 or 4 kilos of hay very well because it's got so much more fiber. The other thing about fiber is it stimulates chewing and saliva production, which is important because saliva is alkaline. And so that is actually keeping your rumen pH right. And so that's another key thing about the fiber, as well as being that habitat for the microbes. And it also regulates your rumen motility. So the rumen moves around, churns around, allows that fiber to drop to the bottom to be regurgitated. And it stimulates that, and it makes the animal feel full. And I skipped over it, but there was a picture earlier on where we had, so the inside the rumen is lined with all these little fingers we call papillae, and that makes the surface area of the rumen much bigger, allows it to absorb much more of the volatile fatty acids. So when a lamb is born, or a kid is born, they have a tiny little rumen, doesn't have the fingers, they have no ability to ruminate. And then as they start eating grass and shrubs and other fibrous things, then that will go into the rumen. Whereas when they drink milk, it bypasses those first 3 stomachs and goes straight through, basically, or the first 2, and straight through into the 4th stomach, and is digested like, so a little lamb or a little kid, that bypasses through, goes straight into the forestomach, and that's digested like we would digest milk or a dog would digest milk. And then all the fiber goes into their rumen, and then as they develop, you'll get more bugs in there, and they're able to actually handle more and more fiber. And at the same time, the grain and the different feed sources stimulate the rumen papillae, the fingers, to grow. So that really takes a 4 to 5 month process, unless you speed it up, which you can do with feeding extra grain, which is what people do with calves, etc., when they're dairy calves. Okay, so lots of information there on how to feed, what's in the feed, how you're going to use it. Well, obviously, what you need to do is go and think about what your sort of stock you've got. There's some really good resources out there. One I'd highly recommend is one called Drought Feeding and Management of Sheep. It's normally a guide for drought, but it's honestly a guide for all year round. It's got a fabulous resource. It's a PDF downloadable off the web. I've put the link there, and it gives you here. So as you can see here, we've got for the different live weights, that's a DSE rating. It gives you how much energy those animals require a day and how much protein they require a day, and that's a protein percent. And that allows you to then go and calculate. So you can estimate how much is in your grass. You can look at a feed bag. It will tell you the energy per kilo. You can get feed tests on your hay and silage, and you can calculate a ration using this sort of information. If you are a techno person, there's this really good app and also website from the New South Wales government, which is called the Drought Calculator. And there's several there, but the Drought and Supplementary Feed Calculator allows you to actually put in, as you can see here, you've got, you can put in different animals. So you can put in, you've got 20 ewes, they weigh 55 kilos, you're going to feed them for 30 days. So you're putting in, I need to get through the next 30 days. What do I need? You can then put in pasture details. So how much pasture have you got? How much is dry grass? Roughly how much dry matter per hectare is there, etc., etc. And so your average pasture height across the paddock and your density allows you to calculate. So they will then calculate how much grass is there. So if you go out with your ruler and you're going, well, what do I do with this? You can put all this information into this app. And then the next bit is that you can then pick up some pellets. So you go and get your pellet bag, or you go and get, you can look up the analysis for hay or silage. We'll talk a bit more about the reliability of that in a minute. Or preferably you get a feed test and you go, right, I've got this type of feed. So you can basically put the feed type in and it will calculate how much you need to feed for each animal. And it also then gives you the costing. So if you want to use that, it is quite intuitive to use. I'm not going to go through it in great detail now, but it is, we're doing this recording. You'll get the slides. You can go and get the app. And there's also some other good resources on the website to help you use it again. The only thing I would say is it doesn't account for fiber. So it looks at energy and it looks at protein, but that doesn't physically mean that they can eat enough. So the other thing you got to bear in your mind is, yes, we might get our ration right, but how much can they eat? So as I said, like your sheep's going to eat between 1 and 3 kilos of feed a day. If it calculates you need 5 kilos of feed, that ain't going to work. 3% of body weight is a good guide for an average sort of feed. It will be less than that if it's like a straw or something like that, or a poor quality hay, and it'll be more than that if it's a grain. But if you worked on, so 3% of body weight means if you have a 50 kilo sheep, let's go 50 kilo sheep, then 10% of body weight is going to be 5 kilos. 1% of body weight is going to be 0.5 of a kilo. So if it's a 50 kilo sheep, it should be able to eat 1.5 kilos of feed. So if you put into this feed calculator and it says this ration requires them to eat 3 kilos, you're going, that's not going to work, and it does not calculate for that. So that's just something to bear in mind. But it is a good way of at least getting a rough idea of what they need, more than a rough idea. Okay, so if you're like the farmers up here, we've had a really cold winter. We've got quite a few farms. The grass is now beginning to grow, but we've got some pretty skinny stock and they're doing it tough. As I said, if you've got grass that is really, really short, you probably want to get some supplements now to let your grass go away, and then you'll have grass in 4 weeks' time. Otherwise, if they keep eating it and keep eating it, they're really hungry, it'll take for another 2 months before your grass really gets away. So what can you purchase to feed your stock, and how do you know what to get? So let's talk a little bit about forages. So, a common one is that small square of lucerne from the feed store, but it's not always the correct one. And there's lucerne hay and there's lucerne hay. The thing to remember about lucerne hay is that most of the protein and most of the good feed is in the leaf. So if you're feeding it out and you're losing a lot of the leaf, then in fact, it's not as good feed as the feed test says. The other thing about lucerne for sheep and goats, if it's really long and stalky, they actually find it quite hard to eat all that stuff, because especially with silage rather than hay, but they really need shorter chopped feed, not really long stalky stuff. Okay, you can have oaten hay. There's a whole heap of cereal forages you can get. You can get cereal silage, but you really want to try and get that short chopped, as I said. The other thing to watch with lucerne and goats is, with your male goats, is they're very, very prone to getting calculi, and lucerne is something you should not be feeding your male goats. So if you've got male castrated goats, then you want to be looking at a grass hay, or if you can't get a grass hay, you can mix oaten and lucerne half and half together, but you will get much more problems on lucerne with male goats. So just be a little bit careful there. So those are the kind of things that you might be feeding your stock. There's sorghum, there's all sorts of other things you can get. How do you know if it's any good or not? So someone says, oh, I've got some hay, come and have a look at it, whatever. So yes, a general rule, ryegrass and clover lucerne is going to be better than native pasture. You can also get some fairly good hay out of good phalaris or good cocksfoot, but your ryegrass and clovers are going to be better. Things made out of kikuyu or native pasture is probably not going to be as good. And as a general rule, without even getting it feed tested, I'd say is really only good for your dry stock. Has it got stalk or has it got seed heads? So if it's gone to seed, so it's got lots of stalks and lots of seed heads, then the chances are that it's going to be that it's going to be not so good quality as a shorter grass. If it's green, then it's probably going to have been more fresher than browns. It won't have been on the ground so long. Is it moldy? Has it got weeds in it, etc.? And a feed test is a really good idea, because this slide is going to show you that there's a massive variation in the type of hay you can buy. And so if you're buying it from a feed store, ask if they got a feed test, particularly if, again, you're trying to feed those young stock or those pregnant stock. Even if it's a lucerne, doesn't mean to say it's top quality, top notch. And if it's got quite high NDF, so quite high fiber, and you've also got quite lots of dry grass around, then they probably aren't going to eat it that much. So you probably want to match it with your grains, rather dry pasture with a grain rather than with a silage. So this is a silage that we had. We got it tested. It's a ryegrass clover silage. It's mainly got ryegrass in it. It's really short grass, and it's all grass. There's no weeds. There's no seeds in it. We've got a feed test on it. So the key things, this is a complicated feed test because we're looking at how well it was ensiled as well. But the key things to look on your feed test is what's the dry matter, because if you're feeding out and with silage, it can be literally from 25% to 60% dry matter. So if you pick up a bale, or your bales weigh 500 kilos, there's still a really big difference what the dry matter percentage is. So it's important with silages to know the dry matter percentage to actually work out how much dry matter you're feeding. Hays are all going to be 80 to 90%, so that's more reliable. Grains the same, but your silages can be highly variable. Protein's important. So I've given you tables there with different protein percentages, but Anything less than a 10 is not going to be any good for growing stock, and it definitely isn't going to be good for growing stock. You really want it 12 to 14 plus for growing stock and lactating stock, unless you've got a lot of green grass and just short green grass, because that will be high in protein. And the other key one is your energy, because again, if you're feeding that lactating or young stock, you want to have your energy levels up around 10 plus, and you can then use that to calculate how much you need. So this is a lucerne haylage. It was sold as silage, but it's not. You can see from the gumboot, it's long, it's stalky, there's not much leaf matter on it. The feed test was pretty ordinary, and that would be really hard for sheep particularly to eat, because it's just all wrapped up in a big stalky mess. When you get to the feed store, so what can you get from the feed store as far as pellets, etc., like pellets, lupins, fava beans, corn, they're all good things for sheep and goats. Your lupins and your beans are great protein sources. Your corn hasn't got so much protein, but it's got really good energy. If you're buying a pellet, look at the bag label, or talk to the person in the feed store, but look at the bag label. What sort of stock is it for? Does it say it's for lactating animals, or is it just a dry sheep mix? Again, look at your protein, look at your energy. Does it have minerals added or not? Because if you've got your minerals added, then maybe you don't need to be supplementing other sort of minerals. Or maybe if you use a lot of other mineral supplements, you need to be a bit careful if you're putting minerals in another way. Should you feed grain or should you feed a pellet? Well, a pellet is generally safer. If you're feeding grain, you can feed a kilo or so of grain, maybe kilo of grain max, and you want to start at a low level. You can get it higher than that, but you certainly want to start a bit less than that. If it's not introduced slowly, depending on the type of grain, you can get your acidosis, which is where you get your fast fermentation. And also with a grain, if it's not, it needs to often be squashed or milled to get the most out of it, rather than just being a whole grain, else it just goes straight through them. Grains are often high in energy and often have variable protein. If you're getting a pellet, again, there can be a lot of variation, but generally you'll have something on the bag that tells you what it is, so you can work with it. You can also at the moment get these things called grain-free pellets, which are designed in the beef industry. We've got the grass-only market, and so that people are feeding pellets but actually hasn't got grain in it, and they're actually a higher fiber pellet, so they're actually a little bit safer to feed as well. But if you've got a lot of high fiber grass, or you're feeding it with high fiber hay, then maybe they can't eat enough. So it's again matching that. What sort of other forage have I got, because they need to be able to eat it all. Little thing for bearing in mind, this is about biosecurity here. If you're going to be feeding your animals and you have storage bins, don't mix your dog food and your ferret food with your cow, sheep, pellets, etc., because there is a possibility that's going to spill in there, and then you're not meant to feed ruminants meat. Okay, so you should never have any sort of canine, dog, cat, ferret, whatever food anywhere near your ruminant feed, because there's a risk you're going to be inadvertently feeding them meat. The other thing is that a lot of ruminant feeds have a thing called rumensin in them, which helps digestion, also keeps away a thing called coccidiosis. Now that's highly toxic to dogs and horses, so you really need to keep feed for different animals completely separate for a number of reasons. Now I realize we're probably just going over time, so I'm just going to quickly whiz through this last bit. Important thing with sheep and lambs is that when your sheep and lambs often don't adapt to grain very well. So important thing to do before you wean your lambs is to actually feed them grain with their mums. Only need to do it 2 or 3 times, so they see their mums feeding, they get a taste for it. And then if it comes to a drought or a dry time, or you need to feed, they're going to be much easier to get onto a pellet or a grain than they would be if you hadn't done that. And this is a common practice, with sheep farmers. Lick feeders are great. They're an easy way to feed out. So if you are going to be feeding grain to your stock, then have a look at a lick feeder. Again, you want to read the instructions really well. if you want to feed anything other than pellets, if you want to feed whole grain, you want to start them off with pellets. It needs to be full all the time. You need to start them down with a really small level and then increase it. But it is a great way of feeding stock and much more common in the last few years. So yeah, that's probably all I'm going to say about nutrition. And I'm just going to quickly touch on a couple of common diseases we see around lambing and kidding. And so I sort of emphasized with the condition score that nutrition around the time of lambing and kidding is really important to get right, because we don't want to have to pull lambs. We don't want them getting preg tox. We don't want them going down. So we want to make sure they're in really good condition score 6 weeks before lambing, and keep the feed up to them at a moderate level so they don't get too fat, but they don't get too skinny. And that will get rid of a lot of your diseases, because so many of your periparturient diseases are around the fact that they can't eat so much because they're getting fuller and fuller of lambs. They've got this big draw of lambs taking all their energy out of them. And then they lamb down and they're trying to adapt to lactating and look after their lambs. So it's important that they have really good nutrition. Preg tox is what happens when they are not getting enough energy, and generally occurs in late pregnancy with ewes with twins and triplets. It is really hard to treat. Ewes love to die with this one. They have problems getting up and down. They're not eating. They can sometimes have nervous signs. And if you've got animals going down with preg tox, it's a real sign that you've got more in your flock that are actually going to also be very energy deficient. There's this product called ketol. It's also called acetol. There's a few different names for it, ceton, and it is an energy supplement. So if we're low in energy, we take glucose, but we want to give those sheep those volatile fatty acids. This is basically your volatile fatty acids in a bottle. And so you want to supplement that then with that. Sometimes if they're down, they're also low in calcium. If you're getting preg tox, I'd say basically talk to your vet, work out if it's preg tox hypocalcemia, so you're treating them appropriately. So hypocalcemia is what we call milk fever. Again, because they don't need much calcium when they're dry, but then they are now needing calcium for the milk. Like basically they only have so much calcium in their blood system, and there's a lot of calcium needed for milk. So basically all the calcium in their blood system goes out into their milk within 6 to 12 hours. So there's this, all of a sudden they need to mobilize all this calcium, and sometimes, especially if they're older, they don't do it very effectively, and so they get what we call milk fever. They can't get up. So calcium is important for muscle contractions, so they basically go down, they collapse, etc. And again, if we've got a couple of sheep with milk fever or goats with milk fever, then the chances are that there's more in the flock that are also low in calcium. So that might be, there's a whole heap of different reasons around it. Again, I'd say if you're getting milk fever, talk to your vet, because there's 2 or 3 ways of fixing it, and it would depend on what the underlying problem that's causing it is. Another one we see around the time of lambing is mastitis, and so that's infection of the udder. So there'll be the sheep. So if you ever got a sheep that's down after lambing, it's looking really miso, then always check the udder. Can be treated with antibiotics if you can get it early enough. And obviously if it's in both of their quarters, then should be halves in sheep, not quarters, but we call them quarters. Then we need to actually supplement our lambs as well, because the milk isn't going to be any good. So if you've got sheep looking miserable after lambing, always check their udders, make sure they haven't got mastitis. If they have, you need to get antibiotics into them quickly. Another one we see quite commonly is vaginal prolapse. It often occurs pre-lambing, can also occur after lambing. And again, it can also be associated with a whole heap of nutritional and whole heap of factors. But one of the key ones is actually tail docking too short. So if you're docking your animal's tails, should be basically the end of the tail should be below the vulva. Otherwise, as it grows up and shrinks, they're more likely to get rectal prolapses. They're more likely to get vaginal prolapses. If they've got twins and triplets, they're full up, their abdomen's really full, that's going to push out that vagina as well. Again, if you're getting them, they can be replaced. You can get special harnesses to do it, but if you've not done it before, get your vet to show you how to do it. And then another one is metritis. That's infection of the udder, infection of the uterus. And so that happens after lambing as well. So if you get this sick sheep after lambing and it's not mastitis, the next thing is, has it got a foul discharge? Again, and sometimes they can keep their placenta in. So again, if that's the case, then they need treating with antibiotics. And the final one is bleeding after lambing. That can be life-threatening, and it's often what happens when sometimes you pull a lamb and there's blood vessels in the wall of the vagina, and that can actually bleed as well. Don't mistake it though, because often when you pull a lamb out, there will be a lot of blood anyhow, because you've broken that umbilical cord. So a little bit of blood isn't a problem, but sometimes they can bleed quite badly after lambing, and it can be, if you can find the blood vessel, great, but otherwise you need to get someone there pretty quickly to assist. So I think that's everything. Sorry, I got a little bit over time. There's a whole heap of resources. There's some great resources out there on the web on all the things feeding. So hopefully you can put what I've said together with all that resources, and that will help you in making sure that you've got great stock in great condition, which will also mean they're way, way healthier. That's me. If you want to follow up on anything, and that's Dom's last slide. We want to get some feedback on how we've gone. And so also, if you have any questions, then please put them in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. There's some great information in there. And just to reiterate, we'll send these slides out to you, so you have those resources. If you have questions, please put them in and we'll start answering those. We do have one on sheep staggers, Alison.
That was the slide that I knew that one was coming. So normally, is that the one you got pre, or is the person online now?
That's just come through, that one. So okay. It's about, my neighbor had a sheep with ryegrass staggers. I had a lamb with phalaris staggers. Never had either before. How to avoid it? Okay,
that's what I want to know. When is it happening? So staggers are generally associated. I mean, sometimes they can get staggered around the time of lambing with milk fever type thing, but staggers are generally associated with a range of different grasses, okay? And they can be really difficult to control. Now, phalaris is actually a little bit easier in that we need to give them cobalt. So you can get a cobalt bullet, and they have been on the phalaris for a while, but you can get a cobalt bullet, or you can spray the pasture with cobalt, but often a lot of people use the bullets, and you can put that basically into the rumen, and that will protect them against the phalaris staggers. Again, there's different varieties of phalaris. Obviously, you've got what you've got, and it's pretty hard to change it, but there are some older varieties of phalaris which you're more likely to get staggers with. Same with your ryegrass. Your ryegrass staggers are your old thick perennial rye type grasses. The grass produces basically a toxin to protect itself, but that toxin is also toxic to sheep and cattle. And what the cattle do is they get very staggery, or the sheep do, they get very staggery. They can get literally, I've got a great video of some in a trailer, but they're all just shaking. They will fall over, they will, and especially when they get stressed. Unfortunately, there is no treatment for either of those. You just have to move them off the offending paddocks. So if all your farm is the same sort of ryegrass, it's really an issue, and you have to probably supplement them. But it's really looking at the type of grass you've got, and where possible, being aware if you're replanting not to use those older style grasses, which are more likely to give you staggers. But there is no easy prevention if your whole farm is covered with a species that is going to give staggers. And the other thing is, it's normally in autumn, so specific times of year. So with both of those, we normally see them. No, with the phalaris, we see it with the new young shoots coming through after the autumn break, Whereas with the ryegrass daggers, that can sort of be any time really in the autumn. We'll see that, again, probably with the newer shoots coming through, just trying to protect those plants as they grow.
Great. Thanks, Alison. Next question. Where can I get a feed test done and how much does it cost?
Great question. So there's 2 or 3 people that supply feed tests. There's one called Feed Test in Victoria. And so, and they actually also do feed bags, but I would say if you're sending off silage or grass, you need to express post it. They cost between $70 and $100 depending on where you send it and what you're testing for. The other one I like to use for silage is the Forage Labs lab, but there's 2 or 3 different labs out there that will provide that service. If you're just looking for a basic feed test on a hay or whatever, then you don't need to do the complicated one I showed. You just need to get one that looks for energy, fiber, and protein are your key things in your dry matter, those 4 things. But if you're trying to evaluate how good your silage is, then that more complicated feed test does a really good job at it.
Right. What is the best, safest supplementary feed for elderly weather goats when plain grass hay is not enough in winter? I want to protect against UC, but nervous about feeding any kind of pellet grain.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Yes. I mean, I don't think there's a really easy answer for that because you do want to be avoiding the grain. So I would be trying to find the best quality grass silage with the lowest fiber you could get, or possibly silage wouldn't be, I presume you've only got a couple. So, but yes, I would be just trying to find a really, really high quality ryegrass hay. I think is the most simple, practical thing rather than just a normal basic hay. So it might be trying to locate a farmer that makes really good quality hay, or to shandy that little bit of lucerne with a little bit of in there. But just, I think where we really see the problems is where people are just feeding a lot of lucerne. So you could put a small amount in there, but you certainly don't want to make it any more than 10 to 20% of the diet. And again, it's got to be good quality. So it's really getting that high quality feed there. But they should do okay on a good quality grass hay.
And to clarify, UC, to protect against UC.
Urinary crystals, I'd say.
What's that?
Urinary crystals, I
Urinary
think
crystals.
UC would be, because what happens is with different feeds with the wethers, and it happens with all goats, but the problem is with wethers, they have a tiny little entrance to the end of their penis. They have a little appendage on the end of that, and that gets blocked with the crystals. So it's the female goats get it as well, but they don't have a problem urinating. Boars get it, but they have, it's really, especially, early castration can be a bit of a problem. So if where possible, getting goats that are castrated, a little bit later, it helps develop the urethra. But yeah, you don't normally see it in boar goats, but it's more your wethers that's the issue. Your rat, yeah.
Thanks for clarifying.
Entire males are not so much of a problem.
Yep. We still have 10 minutes, so please keep the questions coming in. Is there a mineral mix you can recommend to help prevent against foot scald?
Foot scald is if you have some zinc can definitely help protect it against it a bit. Also foot dips can help protect against it a bit, but having enough zinc in your diet, which may be in your pellets or etc. But it is, if you're not supplementing a pellet, is pretty hard to feed it. Yeah.
Can you get that in a mineral lick?
I'm not sure there's enough in it to make a difference, to be honest. I'd have to check. Certainly it's not very palatable. So yeah, it's probably a pellet would be your best option. And they don't all have it in either. But it may be in low qualities in a lick. The thing I find about your licks is that it's pretty variable as to has it and who doesn't, as far as which sheep get it and which don't. So a lick isn't going to give a consistent answer across all animals.
Good to know. Are my lambs okay to eat grass from my septic discharge line in my paddock?
I'm assuming the septic discharge is under the paddock and so well enough down, and so it should actually really only be pretty much good, like supplemented water. So I don't think that's a problem, as long as the septic discharge is, if it's a proper septic and it's well buried, then what comes out is actually fine. We have one in our paddock too, and our calves eat it, and I've never had an issue. But obviously, if it's something on the surface, then there is obviously a disease risk.
Do I need to separate sheep and goats if feeding supplementary feed?
Depends whether they're going to bully each other, I guess. So I think the thing about feeding supplementary feed is to spread it out enough so that everybody gets some. And the other thing is, if you have wethers in there and you're feeding quite a lot of grain, then there is that bigger risk crystals as well. So if you have wether goats in there and you're going to be feeding more than a smidgen of grain, then you might want to separate them. Otherwise, if they're females or entire males, I think the only thing is it depends on like the size difference. But if you spread your feed out enough that everybody gets a reasonable amount, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you've got a couple of very dominant animals in there, then it might be.
If you're feeding out silage, how many days can you feed it out for before it starts to go off? Is there a time?
Yeah, it does. So once you open up the silage, silage is an awesome feed, but I didn't really cover it too much because, I guess if it depends on how many animals your smallholders have got. But once you open it up, is it going to start re-fermenting again? So if one way of doing it is to open it up and then try and close it over. So you, for instance, like with the big farms, they actually get these huge long tubes and they open it up and pull a silage bowl out and then close it over again. So you can probably, if you cut your wrap really well and maybe take a third out of it, and then you could sort of put some string back around it and rewrap it and tape it, then that's actually going to stop so much spoilage. But once you've opened your bale, probably it starts fermenting again, so the energy decreases as much as anything else. So and eventually it will start rotting. So preferably within 3 or 4 days would be good. I'm sure it wouldn't do any harm within a week, but it is decreasing as a feed source the longer it is open. So I'd be looking more at finding ways of getting, the problem is that you've got to unroll it to get it there. So whether, if you really want to save it, you might want to even get half of it out and then see if you can wrap something around the remaining half and put it back somewhere, but with a bit of effort in there for sure.
That's a great tip though. And if introducing grain, I know you said the 10-day for new feeds, roughly 10 days. On the first day, how much should you be feeding?
I would only be feeding 300 grams probably per animal, something like that, just a low level, and increase that over the first week.
Great. And that's similar with goats as well?
Yeah. And if any change in feed, but particularly grain, because it will ferment and they will guts it, particularly if they've had it before. This is a cow phrase, but it will apply to sheep as well. I did hear recently of someone that had been a massive spell of wheat and a whole heap of sheep died. But there's a cow phrase that says, cows given free choice choose death. And what that is if you have a silo spill or something like that and they can eat as much grain as they can, they will, and that will kill them. Okay. So it's particularly that feed change with grain, you don't want to give them too much. So I'd be starting them off on, a small amount and then increasing it. You can definitely feed them up to a kilo or even more than a kilo if they're bigger sheep, but you just want to be doing that, increasing it slowly over up to, so you just increase it every day, every second day, how often you're feeding it. And so you're not reaching a maximum for at least 2 weeks. And then and also making sure that they've got lots of forage and others feed with it, so they're not really, really hungry as well.
Terrific. I purchased hay that was 12 months old and the sheep sat on it rather than eat it. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Um, I don't think it's so much it's 12 months old. I mean, hay will keep for a couple of years if it's stored properly, but if it'd been out in the rain, then it probably won't have been stored properly. So I think again, it's look, I would like to know. I think it's just the age. I'd say, what was that hay made out of? Was it stalky? Was it really long so they couldn't actually eat it? As I said, sheep like short top stuff. So if you've got really long stalky stuff, they're going to struggle to eat it. If it's mainly stalks and a bit of seed heads and no grass, it's not yummy. It's just like cardboard to them. So they're just going to go, hey, this is nice and warm, but I can't eat this very much. This is like you trying to give me trying to, give you a feed of cardboard, Dom. I don't think you'd be very happy about it.
That's it. And it might be worth getting a hay ring or something that can separate the hay and the animals too.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea as well. Absolutely. And I guess looking at the type of feeders you've got as well, with your feeders, you need again to have enough space that everyone's getting something rather than there's this big rush and if there's a big rush and whatever you're feeding out is gone, in a short while, and there's the weaker, skinnier animals aren't getting it, you need to be reviewing how and what you're feeding.
Great point. There's a couple more questions. They're probably not nutrition related, but there's no harm in answering them. Is there an ideal mix of wethers use rams? Off topic, but interested.
Ideal mix? Well, depends on what your goals are, really, isn't it? Like
the farmer has 20 sheep.
Yeah, so you've got 20 sheep. Well, if you want to breed them, you'll need one ram, and that's all you need. And as far as an ideal mix went, I think it would just be whether I'd be looking at how much land you've got. I mean, obviously, if you like breeding them, you can put the ram somewhere else when you don't, when you're not using him or whatever. Or even like some people just run them with the sheep, I guess. But if you like that, having the lambs around all the time, and you've got the capability on your farm to have the extra stock when there's lambs, then you'd have lambs. And if 20's got you maxed up and you quite don't want the hassle of lambing, then you'd have more wethers. I don't think there's really an ideal mix there. But you definitely only need, well, you don't definitely, ideally you only need one ram for those sheep as long as he is working effectively.
Terrific. How can I keep water clean in a trough if it's getting manky?
Actually important, particularly if you've got sheep in containment or something else like that, to clean your troughs out regularly. You can get trough blocks and stuff which are designed to clean them out, to keep the mold off it, to empty the trough regularly to keep the water clean. Get a trough block. Some people even put a little bit of copper sulfate in there, but you just got to be careful you don't overdo it, because sheep are very, very sensitive to copper. So even though I think a lot of cattle people do that, I don't think that's a great idea to do with sheep.
And there is usually a plug as well.
Sorry?
There is usually a plug, especially on the new ones.
There should be a plug to drain it, absolutely. So draining it out regularly and refilling it is a great way to go. Copper has actually been shown to help control worms in goats. In goats, you can use a higher level of copper, but I wouldn't be putting copper in troughs with sheep comfortably, because they are very sensitive to copper toxicity.
And final question tonight for you, Alison. What's the best time of year to shear?
Good question. There are some people, and I think this is shown it depends on how you manage them. There's some people that would shear before lambing, because there's a theory that if your sheep are cold, they will look after the lambs better. I'd almost say in this day and age, it's when you can get a shearer. Otherwise, I think if you're shearing them, I think the preferred time for most people to shear would be coming into summer, so you've got better control with fly strike.
Great. And it's good to keep in mind that sometimes it can take a couple of months to get a shearer. So
yeah, absolutely.
Think ahead.
Yeah. And as I said, sometimes it might just be when you can get a shearer these days, unfortunately.
Exactly. That's it for the questions. So thank you, Alison. It's been a great presentation. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a great night. and we hope to see you again soon.
No worries. Thanks, Tom.
See you.
See ya.